gears up for another primetime hearing in just a couple of hours. What the panel is aiming to show and who is expected to testify. And more than half of U.S. states face more excessive heat warnings or advisories. How the nation is dealing with soaring summer temperatures and when, possibly, we could all get some relief. Plus, U.S. jobless claims rise to their highest levels in 8 months. The Labor Department says applications for jobless aid rose 7,000 last week to 251,000, the most since last November. And later this hour, Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney's work on the January 6th Select Committee has raised her national profile. But back home, she's fighting for her political life. The latest on former President Trump's efforts to unseat her from Congress. But we begin with President Biden testing positive for COVID-19. The president posted a short video on Twitter earlier today saying he's doing well.
Hey folks, guess you heard this morning I tested positive for COVID. But I've been double vaccinated, double boosted. Symptoms are mild, and I really appreciate your inquiries and your concerns. But I'm doing well. I'm getting a lot of work done. I'm going to continue to get it done. And in the meantime, thanks for your concern, and keep the faith. It's going to be okay.
Under the heading of mild symptoms, the White House says they include a runny nose and dry cough. The 79-year-old Mr. Biden is taking the antiviral drug Paxlovid. The president received 2 doses of Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine shortly before taking office, a first booster shot in September of that year, and an additional booster dose on March 30th of this year. First Lady Jill Biden says she has tested negative. At today's White House press briefing, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said the president will continue to work in isolation, again, until he tests negative. And COVID-19 response coordinator Dr. Ashish Jha, who was also there, said the president's vaccination status means his risk of serious illness was, quote unquote, dramatically lower.
In terms of my conversation with the president, he sounded great. I asked him, Mr. President, how are you feeling? He said, I'm feeling fine. He said he was feeling fine. He had been working all morning. He hadn't even been able to finish his breakfast because he had just been busy. I encouraged him to finish his breakfast.
He has mild symptoms. He continues to work, and like many Americans, this is we have to make sure that we send out message to make sure to get vaccinated and boosted if you haven't yet.
For more on this, Tolu Olorunipa joins me now. He is the White House Bureau Chief for the Washington Post, and I believe the newly minted White House Bureau Chief for the Washington Post. So many congratulations on that, Tolu. Busy day at the White House today. So briefly, how is the president doing, and how is the White House explaining how he will do the work of president while in isolation?
Yeah, Major, you mentioned mild symptoms. That's the way the White House is describing it. We saw the president on that video. So that's the evidence that we have of how he's doing. Now, obviously, as reporters in the White House press briefing room, we're going to be asking as many questions as possible to try to get as much information and transparency as possible, because there has been a history in this country of presidents not always being forthright and forthcoming with the public about their health. Now, President Biden is 79 years old. He is at a higher risk of serious concerns from the COVID-19, but he also has a number of things going in his favor. He's got the the vaccination, the boost, the double boost, as well as a number of therapeutics that he's going to be treated with, and the best healthcare in the world. So according to the White House, he's doing fine. But in our profession, we're going to be watching very closely, seeing if there's more information that comes out, seeing if we can hear from the doctor that's treating him directly beyond just a statement, and maybe having Kevin O'Connor, that doctor, come out and answer questions about some of those mild symptoms and whether those symptoms get worse or whether they get more intense over time.
And Tolu, as you mentioned, that was a bit of friction at the briefing today because, as you just said, Dr. Kevin O'Connor, the president's personal physician, who is the one who actually saw the president, took stock of him today, wasn't at that briefing. And if you're going to talk about transparency, it seems reasonable to assume that the most transparent way to do that would be have the treating physician at the podium answering questions.
Yeah, I was in the White House press corps at the same time when Donald Trump, the former president, was contracted COVID-19 and was taken to Walter Reed. And during that period of time, we did hear from the doctor that was treating him. Now, there were a number of questions about transparency and spin and some of the information that was put out by that doctor, but reporters did have an opportunity to ask him some questions, and even the way he answered the questions or dodged those questions was telling in its own right. So I would expect and hope that we get even more transparency from this White House about how the president is doing. He is an elderly person, and this is this has been one of the top things on his agenda, sort of showing the country how to deal with the coronavirus and showing the country how to live with it. And now that he has not only the vaccine, but also the therapeutics that he could be using, it's an opportunity for this White House to show as much transparency as possible and allow the American people to know that this is something that we don't have to allow to take over our lives, that there's a way to live with COVID-19. There's a way to not have it be as tragic as it has been in the past.
And Tolu, it's my impression that among the things the White House press corps has been trying to learn from this White House is how frequently is the president tested, and what is the approach to the frequency of that testing. We know his most recent negative test was Tuesday of this week. Then, lo and behold, he tests positive this morning. Do you expect the White House to be a little bit more candid about that going forward?
They will continue to get questions about that because that's something that everyone is interested in knowing. Sort of, what is the testing protocol? How do we know that the leader of the free world is being kept as safe as possible, and the people that are coming close to him, the people that he's having close contact with, are also being tested? So that is something that I imagine there will be more questions about because it is key to showing that the White House that has unlimited resources, the best health care in the world, can keep the president safe, can keep the president healthy. And we've heard that obviously this virus and this most recent variant is incredibly contagious. And so it's likely that a number of people are going to test positive. But it's important to know that the resources being put forward by the White House are being used in the best way possible to keep the president safe and to keep the country safe as well.
And Tolu, you made reference to President Trump contracting coronavirus. Today at the briefing, Karine Jean-Pierre said, we knew this would happen. Of course, we all remember back when President Trump contracted COVID, the idea was it really couldn't happen, but it happened nevertheless. And we learned much later how sick President Trump actually was. Take us back to that time and how you compare and contrast that era with this era.
Yeah, this was just a month before the election, so there was a lot at stake. There was a lot riding on the president's health. The president wanted to be out doing rallies, and there was a lot of reasons why the president's aides and the people close to him would downplay how serious the concern was. But reporters kept asking questions. We were trying to put two and two together. Things were not making sense, and it became clear pretty quickly after a lot of those press conferences were not making sense that he was more sick than we understood. And when he was whisked away to Walter Reed, it wasn't clear that he was going to make it out. It wasn't clear that he was going to be okay. Now, he obviously had access to the best healthcare in the world, therapeutic and emergency treatments that he was able to use, and he was able to come out of that okay. But it was a very hairy situation. It was a very dangerous situation for the president, who at the time had not been taking COVID very seriously, had been holding a number of large gatherings without masks, without social distancing at a time when there were no vaccines, there were very few therapeutics, and he was a wanton about the way he dealt with COVID, and he did contract that virus. And so it was clear that the White House was not forthright as possible when they wanted to show exactly what was happening. So journalists had to find out what was happening behind the scenes. And it was a very, very scary situation for the leader of the free world.
Journalists had to find out. The Washington Post's new White House bureau chief, Tolu Olorunnipa. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Major.
CBS News reporter Alex Alexanderton, I sometimes say Alex, forgive me, Alexander, joins me now with the latest on COVID-19. Alex Alexander, they're all interchangeable. So, Omicron subvariants, we know them as BA4, BA5, now account, according to all the reporting you do for us on a daily basis, for more than 9 of 10 new COVID infections. What can you tell us about that phenomenon and the pursuit of a vaccine tailored to these particular variants?
Yeah, well, you'll recall that the FDA said just last month that they had decided after a meeting of their outside vaccine advisors that the next generation of COVID vaccine boosters for this fall should be targeted not just at the Omicron variant, but should include a component of the Omicron variant targeted at BA4 and BA5, which at the time they predicted, and we now know, was going to become the dominant strain here in the United States. Now, with that said, if you think about that timeline, the White House doesn't expect the first of the BA4, BA5 boosters to come around town until October, and those will be just the first batches. The vaccine manufacturers have only started now ramping up production of those vaccines, so real full-scale, full-steam rollouts of those BA4, BA5 vaccines won't come until the winter. By that time, we'll probably be seeing another variant that isn't BA4, BA5. But again, The FDA said at the time that of all of the options they had, hopefully BA4 and BA5 vaccines will widen that coverage, will broaden that coverage in the best way possible of all of the options they had in anticipation of whatever we might be facing come this winter.
And of course, it's worth reminding ourselves that vaccines are not necessarily designed to make sure you never get the virus, but that if you do, that your symptoms are more manageable than if you didn't. But digging in on these two subvariants, BA4, BA5, a little bit more, are we seeing significant changes right now in the U.S. in the numbers of deaths or hospitalizations?
Well, here's the situation, right? If you look, for example, let's take deaths first. If you look at the number of COVID-19 deaths we've been seeing on average per day around the country, we've been averaging somewhere between 300 to 350 COVID-19 deaths for many weeks now. That is not as low as some people would have hoped. That's probably not as low as policymakers and leaders, including at the White House, wish the number of COVID-19 deaths was. But it's also a fraction of the heights that we saw during the last two winter surges that you'll recall. To put that number in context, though, when you look at the regional level, it doesn't look steady at all. You know, you see some regions that have seen these big surges in COVID-19 deaths now slowing down, and you're seeing other places like the Pacific Northwest right now that are seeing COVID-19 deaths double and triple from what they were just a few months ago. So, with that in mind, let's look at hospitalizations now. Hospitalizations are also much higher than they were at this time last year. They're much higher than they were a couple weeks, a couple months ago. But they're obviously also still far lower than those peaks we saw during the past two waves. There's an additional wrinkle when you're thinking about hospitalization numbers. The CDC and federal health officials also track things like ICU capacity. That's the number of those patients who have COVID-19 who are taking up space in those most critical care beds in hospitals. ICU capacity is actually pretty good right now compared to those past two surges. No region around the country is above 8%, which again, just to put that in context, is much better than we saw during some of the previous waves. So it's a mixed picture. Deaths aren't as low as we might hope, as policymakers might hope. Hospitalizations aren't as low, but they also aren't as bad as they were this past winter.
Super important context, Alexander. Thank you so much for that. So people know anecdotally, and the data reflect this, that people are contracting the virus for a second and a third time. Are some people, generally speaking, at a higher risk of reinfection than others?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question, right? It depends on a whole bunch of factors, right? But the biggest two factors that I think most people think about. The first one is, if you were infected with COVID-19 and you survived, what variant that was that caused your first infection. That matters because, for example, when you're thinking about the BA4 and BA5 variants, we have some data now to suggest that if you got infected and survived with the other Omicron variant we saw during the winter, BA1, that you might actually have not as good protection as somebody who, for example, survived the Beta variant or the Delta variant. But that's not including the fact that, immune responses wane over time, just like we know from the vaccines. Depending on how recently you were boosted, that plays a big factor into how good is the protection that you have from those vaccines. That's part of the reason why you're hearing all of this talk now about the potential for rolling out second boosters for people under the age of 50 years old broadly, as opposed to just those older and high-risk groups, and why you're also hearing all of this talk about studies that now suggest people with a first booster who are eligible for that second booster should get it. Because we have data now to suggest that after just 3 months after getting that booster, you see a substantial decline in that kind of immune response. Those are all of the kinds of, very complicated factors that go into one individual person wondering, how did I get reinfected with COVID-19 in just a few weeks?
Ladies and gentlemen, every day we rely on Alexander Tin to understand this story. You can see why. Alexander, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Here's a question. Where did those Secret Service texts around January 6th go? After the agency produced just one single text, there is new scrutiny about why no one appears to have listened to previous warnings about planned data purges. Plus, extreme heat warnings are now in effect for 28 states. This is affecting more than 100 million Americans where heat health emergencies are in place and when relief might be in sight. You are streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
You ready?
A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming the internet.
Technology is baked into the DNA of our generation.
Social media, apps, and games.
I like my iPad, my phone, my Nintendo.
Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, it's one click away.
Is growing up digital a blessing or a curse?
There is so much pressure to be perfect.
We need to have conversations regarding healthier usage.
Are the kids all right? The internet, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging wind.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me! We got it. We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
The House January 6th committee will hold its next hearing in just a few hours. The focus, what President Trump was doing or not doing during the Capitol riot. CBS's Natalie Brand has more from Capitol Hill.
Ahead of tonight's hearing, Select Committee member Adam Kinzinger tweeted a preview, video depositions of White House staffers who were with former President Trump on January 6th.
He was always in the dining room. It's my understanding he was watching television.
Was the violence Capitol visible on the screen on television? Yes.
The panel's 8th hearing will focus on what the former president did and did not do during the first hours of the U.S. Capitol assault, before he later posted this tweet calling off his supporters.
So go home. We love you. You're very special.
The fact that nothing happened and that it took so long for him to act is incredibly puzzling and distressing.
CBS News has confirmed the star witnesses are expected to be former Deputy White House Press Secretary Sarah Matthews and former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger. The committee is expected to detail the efforts by the former president's inner circle to try and convince him to take action during the assault, as well as the fallout later that evening and into the next day. The Washington Post reports that fallout could include outtakes from this video released by the former president on January 7th.
My focus now turns to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power.
The committee says tonight's hearing is likely not the last one. There's a potential for more, especially around the release of their report expected later this year. Natalie Brandt, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
I want to bring in Robert Costa and Nicole Skanga. Robert is CBS News' chief election and campaign correspondent. Nicole is CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter. So, Robert, we know tonight's hearing is expected to focus on the 187 minutes during the Capitol riot in which the president was expected to do something, but actually didn't. How far down that road do we expect the committee to go?
There will be two first-hand witnesses to Trump's conduct on that day, Matthew Pottinger and Sarah Matthews. Matthews worked in the press office, is highly aware, based on our reporting, about how Trump went about a lagged response in terms of responding to the violence. Matthew Pottinger arrived at the White House alarmed, also based on our reporting, about how slow the president was to react, about the coordination by then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. So there's going to be new evidence and testimony to build upon previous reporting about what actually happened in this period. A president who was not responding to the violence. And remember, this was not just the United States that was dealing with a crisis in democracy here. The rest of the world was watching as this all unfolded, a national security crisis as this all played out, with many world leaders wondering what was going on in the United States, who was in charge.
Nicole, we've just learned that the DHS, Department of Homeland Security Inspector General, sent a letter last night asking the Secret Service to halt its own investigation into those missing text messages on and around January 6th. What more can you tell us about what the Inspector General is now calling, if I have this right, a criminal investigation?
Yeah, so the DHS Inspector General sent that directive late last night. It came in the form of a letter issued to Secret Service Director James Murray. And basically what it said is your investigation could step on our investigation, so we need you to hit pause. Now, we should point out, Major, that the words used were criminal investigation, but in order for criminal wrongdoing to be determined in this case, the Inspector General, if they find suspected criminal wrongdoing, then needs to make a referral to the Attorney General, who would decide whether or not to press charges here. So that is sort of that important nuance. But here's the challenge now for U.S. Secret Service. They are faced with multiple requests from oversight committees. So our viewers might recall that there was a subpoena for those missing text messages issued by the January 6th committee last week. Secret Service is now telling the Inspector General, well, we are legally reviewing whether or not we are going to be able to comply with this pause, because simultaneously we're trying to get those text messages to the January 6th committee. And lest we forget, the National Archives also requested that the U.S. Secret Service issue a report within 30 days to its own office saying what happened to these text messages and was federal law violated in the record-keeping process here, Major.
Important context, Nicole. Robert, you can't separate politics from the conversation around January 6th or the House Select Committee's hearings. And part of that conversation, at least, is a new ad from a Democratic super PAC that will air during tonight's hearing. It focuses on 4 candidates running on former President Trump's stolen election falsehoods. This includes Pennsylvania gubernatorial candidate Doug Mastriano. Talk to us about this ad and how it might play, or how those who are backing it hopes it plays.
When I spoke to Vice President Harris a few weeks ago, I asked her, what's the 2022 midterm campaign all about if it comes down to one thing? And she said, democracy. And that is an issue many Democrats and some Republicans, but many Democrats are elevating ahead of November, because they believe across the board democracy should be front and center, not just in terms of voting rights, so that's critical for them as they make that argument, but also on the January 6th front, and about explaining why what happened on January 6th was a crisis for democracy, why it can't happen again. And Democrats with the super PAC ad are trying to make a case to voters that, yes, inflation's an issue. They believe President Biden is trying to address it. Yes, there are other issues, kitchen table issues that are always front and center in American campaigns. But they want to bring the issue of democracy and January 6th into the conversation and not have what's happening with this committee fade into the ether, politically speaking.
And Robert, if I can just follow up with you on that real quick. So the audience for this is probably less likely to be heavily Republican. I think that's been pretty clear. But lots of independents have been turning in. And so it seems to me that super PAC is trying to reach them as well as solidify Democratic support.
And there is an aim here to have a Republican audience. When you speak to those close to Representative Cheney, Representative Kinzinger, Republican members of the committee, they believe that Republicans, even if they don't react immediately to what they're seeing and hearing in these proceedings, could react down the line ahead of the 2024 Republican presidential nomination fight, and wondered, should the party really nominate or consider nominating Trump again for president? Does he have the fitness for office that Republicans want to see in a nominee next time around? So there's an immediate pitch in some ways to voters ahead of the 2022 midterms about the Republican Party, about democracy. But there is a broader pitch to Republicans as well, because Trump is still on the scene considering another run.
Nicole, let's go a little bit deeper on this text tug of war between the Select Committee and the Secret Service. It has received, as you've said, and as we understand, one text message that they've requested. What can you tell us about what the committee wants in addition to that, and what avenues it might have available to get it?
Well, Major, it's a great question because it lends itself to another important question that I'm sure our viewers are wondering, which is what was the Secret Service even investigating internally before the DHS Inspector General requested that they hit pause on this? And that is previously the DHS Inspector General and the January 6th committee and a series of oversight committees had given U.S. Secret Service a list of 24 officials, and they wanted the text messages from January 6th of those 24 officials. And so what U.S. Secret Service had been doing was poring over the metadata on those cell phones. So not the messages themselves, but who were messages sent to and when, to try to determine of all of those messages from those 24 officials, how many were government records and how many were deleted in this agency-wide cell phone migration. And what they had determined thus far was that of those 24, 10 did not send or receive text messages on January 6th. If that sounds weird, keep in mind this is an agency that relies on radio, email, and other encrypted forms of communications. There were an additional 3 officials that it was deemed they only sent and received personal messages, text messages on their devices. And then there was this one conversation that occurred between U.S. Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund and former Secret Service Uniform Division Chief Thomas Sullivan, wherein U.S. Capitol Police was requesting assistance at the Capitol. That conversation was handed over to the January 6th committee. Now, what do we have left of the 24 officials? We had 10 left that U.S. Secret Service was still trying to probe to figure out were any of these text messages pertinent, and they were compelling their own officers to tell them, hey, do you remember what happened and why you sent this text message to this number on January 6th? Okay, now that we have pressed pause on that, there's another question, which is, even if they determine that some of these government records were deleted, how do you get them back? I talked to an executive at Verizon yesterday who said, while metadata and some location data saved up to a year, those messages are gone. They've been gone since a week after they were sent. Apple also has a company policy wherein they don't go into your phone, which is end-to-end encrypted, unless there's a court order. So really challenging for U.S. Secret Service to try to get back those messages. I imagine it will be equally challenging for the Inspector General or some of these investigative entities, some of these congressional committees that are looking into this question now.
Robert, this is unfair. Less than a minute. Catch us up on Steve Bannon's trial.
Steve Bannon and his lawyers have rested their case. They're going to wait to see what the jury does. Will they convict him of refusing to comply with a congressional subpoena, an unusual case to go all the way to trial? Bannon ultimately ended up not testifying in his own defense.
Robert Costa and Nicole Skanga, thanks so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.
More than 100 million Americans are under excessive heat warnings and advisories. Officials from the National Weather Service say high temperatures will continue across the country through the end of the week. Trinity Chavez has more from New York.
Utility workers in Queens, New York spent hours Thursday trying to restore electricity to hundreds of customers who lost power during one of the hottest stretches of the summer.
It's horrible. It's horrible. I sat outside here until 10 to 4 this morning.
In Baltimore, some people sat in the shade to beat the heat. More than 100 million Americans are under excessive heat warnings and advisories, and the above normal temperatures are expected to continue across much of the United States through the end of the week.
Despite the scorching temperatures, some people are still heading outside, but with a few extra precautions.
The best thing I try to do is stay hydrated. That's the important part.
Petty cab driver Amadou Traore says he drinks a lot of water and stays in the shade in between passengers. But there's an upside to this heat.
Most people don't really want to walk in this heat, so sometimes it kind of brings more customers.
In Central Texas, Brenda Long put an umbrella over her air conditioning unit to save money on her electricity bill, which was $300 last month.
This is the most expensive statement I received since I've been in this house for 26 years.
But AC repairman Gary Mahan says putting umbrellas over AC units can do more harm than good.
All it does is cause it to recirculate hot air into the condenser.
Still, with the temperatures this hot, people are going to do whatever they can to stay cool. Trinity Chavez, CBS News, New York.
After sitting down on occasion for talks with the Ukrainian government since their military invasion began, Russia now says it's not interested in further dialogue. What's more, Moscow now says it wants to take control of more Ukrainian territory. What else the Kremlin is saying about its revised objectives? We will speak to our Holly Williams in Ukraine. You are streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. I'm Major Garrett. Here's a look at some of our top stories. President Biden, as you probably heard, has tested positive for COVID. The president is double vaccinated and has received both booster shots. He's 79 years old. He's taking the antiviral drug Paxlovid, and White House COVID response coordinator Dr. Ashish Jha describes the president's symptoms as mild, dry cough and a runny nose. Jobless claims have hit the highest level since November 2021. Economists suggest the number of first-time unemployment claims, 251,000, up 7,000 from the previous week, indicates the labor market is starting to cool. And the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th Capitol riot will focus on the roughly 3 hours that transpired between when the violence began and when former President Trump issued a pre-taped video message to supporters. Scott MacFarlane breaks down the timeline.
Major, at its hearing tonight, the committee's going to detail the warnings former President Trump received while he was in the West Wing January 6th. The committee says he was in the West Wing dining room, just steps away from the Oval Office and just strides away from the press briefing room from which he could have directed the mob to go home. But it wasn't just warnings from inside the White House. A CBS News review of court filings from the January 6th committee shows the committee has text messages, including from Donald Trump Jr. on January 6th to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, urging the president to condemn the riot and get the rioters to go home. But there were also warning signs inside the Capitol itself. Let me take you to the second floor and show you some of the images the former president would have been seeing if he were watching television that day. In about 2:40, you'll see members of Congress barricaded on the upper level of the House chamber, some of them hiding beneath their chairs, members of Congress from both parties. Inside the House chamber, as the mob approached, it was Republican members of Congress who helped barricade that door with the furniture before police could draw their guns. And about 3 o'clock, as the fighting was still ongoing, a Republican member of Congress from Wisconsin, that's Mike Gallagher, tweeting a video directly to former President Trump, urging him to call it off, to call off the mob. The committee has said former President Trump engaged in a conspiracy to defraud the United States. They'll argue tonight his inaction January 6th was part of it. Major?
Scott MacFarlane, thank you. For more on this, Virginia Congressman Denver Riggleman joins me now, and for the purposes of this conversation, interestingly, he's also a former staff member of the January 6th committee. Denver, what do you expect tonight?
Major, I think they're going to interleave a lot of intelligence elements. You know, I was a counterterrorism specialist. I worked in data. So what I think you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of video. I think you're going to see testimonies, but I also think they're going to utilize data, whether it's text messages, maybe call records, to try to really capture the 187 minutes on that day in January 6th. And I believe with that testimony from the Matt Pottingers and things of that nature, I think they're going to try to present that complete story of what happened that day.
So you're a former member of Congress. I want you to address something that is, to the degree there is Republican pushback about the Select Committee, it's that, well, it's not constituted properly, and because it's not constituted properly, there isn't a chance for other questions to be asked or witnesses to be pressed on information. Address that if you could, because you were in there, the origins of this committee, and what you think it's nevertheless unearthed and presented to the public writ large.
That's a great question. It's a little bit to unpack. First of all, when you look at the constitution of the committee, the staff members are so nonpartisan. A lot of them are AUSAs, they've been investigators, not really part of the political process at all. When you talk about the opportunity Republicans had to add members to this committee or to actually be part of the committee, they sort of let that slide away. So it's very hard for me to have any type of tolerance for that kind of ridiculousness when it comes to arguments. Also, when you look at the evidence that we've seen, has been all Republicans. So it's very difficult, I think, for them right now to push back when you see that the people that are testifying, those that are coming out, whether it's attorneys, whether it's individuals that were in the administration, whether it's staff members, all these individuals are Republicans, they're GOP. So I just think it's very difficult to present an argument that's cogent about the constitution of the committee or how it's constituted or what those individuals represent. Again, if you look at me, former Republican congressman for Virginia, but my background was data analysis and counterterrorism. We just look at the facts, and facts are a very difficult thing to get away from. I know you hear all the sayings, right? But facts are really a 1-2 punch. They're an uppercut, and when they land heavy. And I think tonight you're going to see, some uppercuts as far as facts based on the 187-minute gap that you saw on January 6th.
In the immediate aftermath of January 6, 2021, Denver, there was a sense that maybe the president was frozen. He didn't know what to do. As I listen to committee members describe what they intend to present tonight, that's not the image that's going to linger. It's going to be an image of the president not frozen, but actually enthused by what he saw. And his inactivity wasn't so much because he didn't know what to do, is that he didn't have any intention for a while, a good long while, of stopping what he was seeing play out on the steps of the U.S. Capitol and inside that sacred building.
Major, a lot of people talk about the 187 minutes from 1:10 p.m. to 4:17 p.m. I'm more interested in the 7-hour and 37-minute gap in the call logs or call records. And as an intelligence officer, somebody looks at data, I don't even care the reason. I don't care if it's deliberate or not deliberate. What happened in that time? I think that's what they're going to show today. And when you look at the president, we know this is the 8th hearing. We know that he just wasn't sitting there sort of incapacitated or didn't know what to do. He was activated. And I think when he's watching television, when he sees people that are excited, when you look at his 4:17 video, his 4:17 p.m. video, which was really ludicrous, saying that he loved them all. I mean, these type of things that you see, that's evidence, right? That's sort of a fact-based way of looking at this, is that President Trump was more than likely enthused about what was happening that day. And regardless, you can't go back in the past and change data. You can't change facts. And again, tonight, in prime time, you're going to see that the president was more than likely supportive of those individuals that were there. And he is still spouting the same crap, Major. He's still talking about stop the steal and that the election was stolen. He's still saying the same things. So again, it's really difficult to think that he was so incapacitated or so stupid, or that he was inactive. All these things, I think, are, just sort of ridiculous. I think you had a president or a former president that was pretty excited about what was happening on January 6th.
Denver, as you well know, in about a third of the Republican Party, there is a belief that what happened on January 6, 2021 was in some ways patriotic. The former president describes it as such. You've talked about your previous pre-political life and the work you did there. For Republicans who might be listening to you, who are on the fence about this or who still believe it was more patriotic than not to storm the Capitol, what would you tell them?
It's not patriotic to storm the Capitol based on a fantasy, based on a lie. It's never patriotic to storm the Capitol. It's not even a conservative principle. And I think what you see right now is that so many people were caught up in fantasies, whether they were QAnon conspiracy theories, sort of that conspiracy sticky bomb, right, that everything stuck to, stop the steal, all the ridiculousness, even some individuals believing that, there were children in the tunnels of the Capitol. All that was a fantasy. I don't know if we've ever in the history of our country had something like this happen, where a conspiratorial fantasy, an apocalyptic sort of messianic message of good against evil, really push people to storm the Capitol. And it was a coordinated effort. And I think that's what I would tell Republicans right now is look at the facts. Don't go to the far right fever swamps and, sort of the alt-right type of individuals that are spouting nonsense or grifting off of you individuals out there who are giving money to these type of causes. This was a money-making venture. This was a power grab. We can call this an internal coup. This was based on specific types of documents. It was based on a plan. It had individuals that were really trying to execute a mission. You had a legal theory behind it. You had lawsuits and cases, and all of it was based on a lie and fantasy. And that's what I would tell the Republicans out there is that for this time here, please pick facts over fantasy, because that's the only way we can move forward as a country in really a thoughtful way.
Denver, what can you tell us about this interim report that the committee has said it's going to release sometime in September?
Well, there's so much data. I think they want to, right? I think the reports, I know that it's exciting to see the hearings. I do believe the reports might be more important. I think the interim report is going to capture what they have in evidence up to this point. The fact is they're having more and more evidence come in every day as more and more individuals come forward. And as they see more metadata, or they see more text messages or emails. You saw that Eastman has to give his call detail records up. There's other individuals who might have to give up their CDRs so we can see their phone records. So as that comes in, that's very important. But I think they have to have an interim report that comes out that really encapsulate what's happened up to this point. And I think by December, I think that's when you're going to see the fully bound version of the report that's been finalized, edited, and all the last-minute facts sort of put in there.
Former Virginia Congressman and former member of the January 6th Select Committee, Denver Riggleman, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Major.
Russia's foreign minister says Moscow's military goals in Ukraine will expand if the West continues to supply Ukraine with weapons. This as the U.S. announces a new aid package that includes rockets and ammunition. Meanwhile, Russia has reopened the Nord Stream pipeline and is once again sending natural gas to Germany. The pipeline was shut down for 10 days of maintenance, but European officials feared Moscow would keep the pipeline closed as a way to exert economic leverage over them. Senior foreign correspondent Holly Williams is in Dnipro, Ukraine. Holly, what is the latest on the ground where you are?
Well, Major, Dnipro has actually been fairly quiet since the invasion began, but we have one front line about 120 miles south of here, one about 100 miles east of here, and essentially this conflict seems to be becoming a kind of grinding war of attrition. Many people tell us they think it will be fought for years to come. Yesterday we heard from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said that Russia has only advanced between 6 and 10 miles in eastern Ukraine over the last 90 days. And he said that the Ukrainians are making the Russians pay for every inch of territory that they gain. And when you look at the losses on both sides, they're simply staggering. Ukraine says that more than 35,000 Russian troops have been killed at this point. We can't independently confirm that. On the Ukrainian side, they won't tell us exactly how many troops they've lost. But back in late May, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that at that point, they were losing between 60 and 100 troops every day.
So, Holly, when Russia's foreign minister says Moscow is going to expand its military goals if the West continues to support Ukraine, well, we know the West is going to continue to support Ukraine, and Russia has been frustrated in achieving its earliest military goals. It sounds like bluster to me.
You know what? I think that the reaction to Sergei Lavrov's statement yesterday that Russia was going to expand its territorial ambitions was that nobody was remotely surprised. I mean, first of all, think back to the beginning of the invasion. The Russians were very clearly trying to take Kyiv, the capital, and they were beaten back by a Ukrainian resistance that was stronger than nearly everyone expected. Also, this has never been just about eastern Ukraine. The Russians have captured swaths of land in southern Ukraine. Now, U.S. intelligence said in the last few days that they believe that Russia may be preparing to annex some of that territory in Ukraine that it's captured. Once again, I don't think anyone believes that that's surprising. Think back to Crimea, the last time Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, that was annexed. So all of this is really straight out of the Russian playbook.
And Holly, both sides with various representation of seriousness have been sitting down talking. Couldn't call them actual formal peace talks, but they've been talking. But now Russia says it's pointless to continue those conversations. What is the meaning of that? What is the import?
Well, once again, this is coming from the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. And what he actually said yesterday is that they hadn't heard from the Ukrainian side since April 15. And he alleged that the West was pushing Ukraine not to continue with talks until they could do so from a position of strength. Now, I can't really comment on the veracity of any of those statements, although I suppose that it's very clear that the Ukrainians have been frustrated in those talks. And I guess every country wants to negotiate from a position of strength.
No doubt. So Ukraine has asked NATO for funds and assistance since all of this began, Russia's invasion. What can you tell us about the nature of those resources, what they're getting, and what they still need?
So here's the big headline from yesterday. The US announced that Ukraine is going to get 4 more HIMARS. These are mobile rocket launch systems. The Ukrainians already have 12. They're getting 4 more, bringing them to 16. They are much longer than anything the Ukrainians have in their arsenal otherwise. They have a range of about 50 miles, I believe. We recently spoke with the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Alexei Reznikov, who told us that those weapons are simply game-changing. The Ukrainians say that they've used them to great effect to take out Russian military command posts and arms depots. And there are some pretty spectacular videos that purport to show that on the internet. However, the Ukrainians also say it's simply not enough. A couple of days ago, the defense minister said what they really need is 100 of those HIMARS. The other thing that's worth keeping an eye on is fighter jets. Now, this is something that the Ukrainians have been asking the West for since essentially the beginning of this conflict. I mean, they were saying it to us back in March that they want modern fighter jets. And interestingly, this week, the US Air Force Chief of Staff, General Brown, said that Ukraine may get Western fighter jets. Now, we don't have any more details on that, what kind of jets, when, and which country would provide them.
So, Holly, you and I have discussed this a lot. You were there before this particular invasion began. You've been covering it almost every day since it began. I'd like your perspective on how it's evolved.
You know, it's really interesting. We were here at the beginning of the invasion, and obviously there was this shock, fear, disbelief amongst Ukrainians, but also there was immediately this sense of great unity and great clarity. I think for many Ukrainians, the invasion really crystallized what they want for their country and what they don't want for their country. I guess the big question going forward is whether the Ukrainians can maintain that sense of unity and purpose. Interestingly, this week, President Volodymyr Zelensky sacked 2 very senior officials, including the head of the security service, amid allegations of hundreds of cases of treason. And in fact, the head of the security services was a childhood friend of President Zelensky. They were extremely close. And I think that there's a couple of different ways of looking at this. One is those problems sound pretty terrible. That's pretty worrying. I guess the other way of looking at it is that this shows President Zelensky's strength. That he was willing to make this decision, even though the head of the security service is a close friend of his. Certainly amongst ordinary Ukrainians, you don't get any sense that they are wavering. They are very clear that they're going to fight this invasion. And when you talk to them about perhaps giving up territory for peace, they say that's an absolute no.
Coming to us from Dnipro, Holly Williams, stay safe, and we thank you. The U.S. House has just passed legislation aimed at protecting contraceptive access, this in response to the Supreme Court's recent overturning of Roe v. Wade. The Right to Contraception Act passed largely along party lines Thursday, with 8 Republicans joining Democrats in support. It aims to codify birth control access on a federal level and offers protections for health care workers who provide them. It now heads to the Senate, where it needs the support of at least 10 Senate Republicans. U.S. Army leaders say they are coming up short on recruiting and retention goals by tens of thousands of soldiers. In a memo released Wednesday, officials said they will end the fiscal year with nearly 20,000 fewer service members than they'd hoped to have. They also said that number could indicate a downward trend through next year. To combat this shortcoming, the nation's oldest and largest military branch is boosting enlistment bonuses, giving more choices to where soldiers can be stationed, and giving premiums to anyone willing to ship out within 45 days. Wyoming Republicans are set to decide the fate of the state's only Congresswoman, Liz Cheney. How Cheney is faring in a new poll against her Trump-backed competitor. Local Matters Wyoming is next. You're streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging wind.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
A new poll in Wyoming shows Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney more than 20 points behind her competitor ahead of next month's primary. Attorney Harriet Hageman has the support of former President Trump. Meanwhile, as you might recall, Cheney voted to impeach the former president and is now vice chair of the January 6th Special Committee in Congress. Bob Beck is with me now. He is news director for Wyoming Public Radio. Bob, it's great to see you. Sure, it looks very problematic for Cheney, but only a third of the respondents in this poll that was featured in the Casper Star Tribune said Trump's endorsement had swayed them. What do you make of that?
Oh, I think there's probably a lot of reasons people might be shifting away from Liz Cheney. Trump was part of it. I think there were some people that supported her in the past that were maybe lukewarm about her. She didn't really grow up in Wyoming. She certainly is the daughter of a couple of Wyomingites, but she's not really considered that by a lot of people. And so she had some, as I said, lukewarm support over the years.
And what would you say, Bob, has been Cheney's visibility and sort of touch in Wyoming in the last couple of years? Because it's been my experience that when senior members of Congress get into trouble, one of the things that gets them into trouble is a sense of distance from those who they represent, their constituents. Is that a problem there?
Yeah, it has been. And COVID, of course, was certainly part of that. There weren't a lot of events or opportunities for her to come out. But, since January 6th and some of her statements that particular day and since that time, I fully expected her to come into the state, meet with a lot of folks, explain her thinking, maybe have a level of give and take with folks. And we really haven't seen that happen. Even this year, she's been busy with the commission and working on those types of things. We've had only one debate that she's been part of. And so I was expecting to see a little bit more of her myself, but with some of the things she's doing in Washington, we just haven't seen a lot of her.
So, Bob, as you well know, Cheney has significantly outraised Hageman, but Wyoming is not an expensive place to run. The media market is very comparatively inexpensive. And she's getting a lot of money from outside of the state. Is that a problem? Has that been a part of the conversation? And do you get the sense that her campaign war chest is benefiting her in any way?
Well, it has been discussed that a lot of the money has been outside money. And Harriet Hageman, honestly, if you were to just compare her against a normal candidate, she's raised a ton of money. You don't see races like this in our state very often. This is actually quite a bit of chunk of change. So it has come up. She certainly is running, Liz Cheney is certainly running a number of ads right now and is using some of that money on mailers, the usual stuff. But, I don't know if it's going to be enough, if there's a big blitz coming that might help her out. But this is a significant, if what these numbers that we've seen are true, this is a significant deficit right now.
No doubt. So let's talk about Hageman for a second. Does she have an agenda that runs very much deeper, Bob, than I'm not Liz Cheney, and former President Trump likes me.
Yeah, she does. I mean, she's one that ran for governor 4 years ago, and so many of us are very familiar with her. She's a very strong states' rights person. Actually, she and Liz Cheney are very similar in their stances. Very strong on states' rights, certainly very supportive of our energy industry, not so supportive of things such as climate change, that type of thing. She's a true Republican in the state of Wyoming. She did grow up here. Her father was a legislator. He was the chairman of our education committee for a number of years. So she's got some political ties, but she's been running. She certainly has been using the Liz Cheney isn't here, she's not representing us theme, as she probably should if you want to win this race. And to her success, I think also a lot of the conservative Republicans really do not like that Liz Cheney is on this commission, and certainly did not like that she came out against Donald Trump. And so certainly Harriet Hageman has used that to her advantage as well.
So, Bob, of course, we call this segment Local Matters, but I wonder if you see national implications, because as I hear this and do your descriptions, it's sort of Liz Cheney is a George W. Bush Republican and Harriet Hageman is a Donald Trump Republican. And that's a fault line that is really, it seems to me, central to the future of the Republican Party.
Well, it really is, and I'm fascinated to watch not only this race, but a couple of other races in our state, our Secretary of State race, our governor's race, and just to see how far the right arm of this party in this state has come. Can they influence some of these other races? And, Harriet Hageman is the perfect candidate for them. She's talking about things they care about, a lot of conservative issues, that type of thing. It's not like Liz Cheney's a liberal, though. She 93% of the time voted to support Donald Trump and supports, as I said, a lot of these same things. It's just that, as you say, she's more of a Bush-era Republican, while, I think Harriet Hageman's trying to position herself as more of the Trump person. I think that's accurate.
Bob Beck, we thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.
Well, that does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday to Thursday at 6 p.m. And a reminder, if you want to watch previous episodes of the program, you can see them anytime on the CBS News website. Just head to cbsnews.com/red and blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
An original CBS Reports documentary. The battle to defund the police.
I do see the good in what policing is, but we have to work to get the bad out of it.
Another person get brutalized by the police. How can you block that out?
Hey, hey, ho, ho. These crazy crowds have got to go.
Because everyone doesn't do what they're supposed to do. So to say you don't need police officers, okay, I think we do. We do in my neighborhood.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging wind.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Americans across the country react to the Supreme Court's ruling on abortion, understanding the landmark decision and its impact. For continuing coverage anywhere, stream on the free CBS News app.
Maria Luciano. Thanks for joining us. Here's a look at the top stories we're following right now. President Biden has tested positive for COVID-19. We're at the White House with the latest details on Biden's condition and how his medical team is treating his diagnosis. The House January 6th committee holds another hearing focusing on what former President Trump was doing during the insurrection, what we could learn from witnesses